Okay, welcome back to SPED 738, Module 2. In this video, I just want to touch briefly on some concepts that were mentioned in Chapter 3 related to diversity in the classroom. I think this is really important information for you to have and to always have in the back of your mind as you're serving students with special needs and going through the evaluation process where you're in a critical role of evaluating and identifying a student as having a special need. Because this gives us some really good background information on where students come from and also really paints a picture for us of how in schools we create disproportionality in particular disability areas and kind of how that happens. So I first want to just talk about awareness, just look at some key data that's in your text, and then talk in a little bit more detail about those high judgment categories. And then look briefly at some of the factors that affect disproportionality that kind of help us as special educators reduce that disproportionality that we see in our buildings. There's some interesting numbers that you'll take a look at the table in your text on, what page is that? Page 61. We're looking at figure 3.2. This really looks at the disproportionality of disability by ethnicity. And I think this is really interesting for us to think about because it really paints a picture for us of how particular groups of students are identified more frequently than others. When we look at students who are American Indian or Alaska Native, some of the numbers that stood out to me, and when we're looking at this, remember that any number over 1 means that they are more likely to be identified. Any number under 1 means that they're less likely to be identified. So American Indian, Alaska Native, 2 times more likely to be identified with deaf blindness. 1.84 times more likely to be identified with a learning disability. So if you're working with students who are Native American, I think it's important for you to know these numbers and be aware of them because it can tend to lead to that disproportionate representation. When we're looking at African American students, 2.2 times more likely to have emotional disturbance identification. Okay, and you'll look in your text, you'll notice they talk a lot about suspensions, expulsions. Students who are African American are more likely to be suspended. They're more likely to get those referrals to the principal's office for behaviors. And it talks a little bit in the book about some methods and practices that can reduce that disproportionality. I think that's important for you to know in your building. Some ways that we can reduce that, especially for students who are African American. And then 2.64 times more likely to be identified with an intellectual disability. What we found is historically students who are African American do more poorly on IQ testing. And in fact, there was a court case in California related to the use of IQ tests to identify students who are African American with an intellectual disability. And it ruled that that test was not a good measure for students, that it did not take into account their ethnicity, their language, the factors that affect them growing up. And so that really impacts how those students are identified, that an IQ test typically is what's used when we identify intellectual disability, and we see historically that that is not a good measure for students who are African American. And that kind of brings us into those high judgment categories. I think this is a really good concept for us to be aware of as we identify students with disabilities. Okay, these high judgment categories typically come from categories where students are identified with a disability after they start school. So they're not coming into the K-12 school with a learning disability, intellectual disability, or behavioral disability diagnosis. Typically they may come in with a developmental delay diagnosis, and then this is something that we are testing for later after school starts. These are also the disabilities that we as special educators have greater leeway in terms of our judgment on if students qualify or not. Now, it's not necessarily that we're sitting back and saying, I'm looking at student A and I think he has a learning disability, but we are selecting assessments to identify those students in the evaluation process. And our judgment, we're making our judgment on what assessments we're going to use, right? Sometimes we can use assessments that maybe tend to lean one way or the other depending on what group of students we're working with. I think it's really important to look at figure 3.4 in your text and really become familiar with some of this information, because these are factors that impact student learning, okay? And some of them are really significant when we look at them. I want to look at some of the student family indicators that they talk about in the text. They talk about the percent distribution of family households that are led by the mom, okay? No husband present, no dad present. 50% of African American student homes are in that situation, while only 17% of white, 11% of Asian. Okay, that has a big impact on student environment and then translates to impacting the classroom. So it's something we really need to be aware of. The other thing that is really affecting students in the family environment is language development. And I know a lot of you are in this situation where you have students who are English language learners. And 69% of our Hispanic students are in a home where it speaks a language other than English. Okay, that really impacts student learning because they're balancing two languages, and it's a real challenge and can be a real barrier for their learning. We've experienced this in our own house with the use of ASL and sign language in our home. Both of our boys were delayed and received speech services because they were basically learning two languages from birth to when they entered kindergarten, because we signed so much in our home. It's a dual language home. And what that did is it really created a delay for them in English and a delay in ASL. Now that my middle son is in second grade, he's kind of balanced that out, and he's doing fine now with the English language. But we did see that impact of having a different language in the home. It impacted his learning, it impacted his social skills. And so it's just a really important thing for us to be aware of as we work with students who are English language learners. And then there are some school factors, and I think these numbers are particularly of interest. Talking about achievement first, when we're looking at reading and math achievement, students below grade level. 50% of black students, 43% of Hispanic students are below grade level by the grade of 8 in math, while only 17% of white students. When we look at basic reading achievement levels in grade 8, 43% of black students, 42% of Hispanic students, compared to 16% of their white peers. So we are seeing a significant discrepancy in achievement levels of our black and Hispanic students when we compare them to students who are white. That's really important because that gets into our judgment, right? Does that student have a learning disability, or is that delay in their reading and their math skills due to environmental factors? We have to determine that as special educators. And then when we look at the percentage of students who are suspended, 43% of the black students have ever been suspended, while only 16% of white. Okay, really significant increase when we look at that by racial or ethnic backgrounds. I think that's really important to note. The other thing that I really want you to think about in this book, and they talk about those data on suspension and expulsions, and what's interesting is some research has been done in the use of positive behavior supports. And if we implement positive behavior supports as a building, as an entire building, not as a special ed team, but that is being led by a building principal and implemented, that we see those discrepancies come down by ethnicity or racial areas. So I think that's really important. If you see that as an issue in your building that you're working in, that you see a much higher rate of suspension and expulsion with your black and Hispanic students, really might be worth looking at some of this data on positive behavior supports, because it is showing that there is a significant difference when we implement that at the building level to have those positive impacts on students. You know, I think this diversity is all really good for you to know as a special educator, for you to be aware of the issues that can affect students in the home, that can affect them in your school building, and knowing about those so that you know what impacts your students and you know what can play a part in them qualifying for services. It's really important that we be aware of those things and really putting ourselves in their shoes and looking at, where they come from. What are they bringing into the classroom every day? Understanding those cultural differences is really critical for us to have a good relationship with that student and help them achieve as much as we can. Now in this module we've looked at a lot of things, right? We've looked at UDL, we've looked at inclusion, we've looked at diversity. All those things are related to really meeting that student's individual needs, seeing them as an individual student, not as a group of students, not as the students with learning disabilities that I'm working with, not as the student with behavior disorders that I'm working with, but really looking at them as an individual student. Now to complete this module, I really want you to take a look at the assistive technology connection. This is something that you're going to see in every module pretty much throughout the semester, making a connection for you to the content and having a technology component there that you can take and use in your classroom. The key here is really teaching you more about what assistive technology is, technology tools that are out there, but also really helping you look at how you integrate that into the IEP. And then I want you to complete those chapter review questions. Remember, I'm glad to take a look at a draft if you send those to me a couple days before they're due. I'll get you feedback. And participate in the discussion forum. I'm excited to see your thoughts in this discussion forum when we talk about placement and where best for students with disabilities to learn. So remember, always reach out to me if you have questions, if you need more information. I'm here to be a resource for you and to assist you. Thank you.